We must tell you plainly. She was 43 years old, alone, and standing in the mud of a stage stop with $9 to her name and nowhere on this earth that would call itself home. Her brother-in-law, Reuben Hale, had put her out of the house her husband built with his own hands, declaring, the week after the fever took her husband, that a widow with no children held no true claim to land or store under his reading of the will, and that she should be grateful he'd given her a mule and $9 at all. So she had boarded the eastbound coach for her sister's town, and when it stopped to water the horses at a lonely relay station, she had climbed down to help a sick child breathe easier, and the driver, spooked by a coming storm, had pulled away without so much as a shout of her name. Left with nothing but a carpet bag and those $9. She paid 6 of them to a kindly old station keeper for a quick claim to an abandoned camp up in the ravine that no map had ever bothered to draw, a place folks called cursed and empty. It was, by any sane reckoning, a fool's purchase. But sealed beneath that camp's collapsed hearthstones lay something that would not only rewrite the last chapter of her life, but restore, at long last, a promise broken 12 years before she ever arrived. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Vance. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten by the world, tell us in the comments. We'd like to know you're there. Naomi had been raised in a house that valued mending over throwing away, in the small river town of Hardin's Ferry, Ohio, where her mother took in sewing and her father cobbled boots for men who could pay in coin or in chickens, whichever came easier that season. She was the 4th of 6 children, quiet among louder siblings, and she found early that her gift was not for talking, but for noticing, for seeing the good stitching hidden beneath a torn hem, the sound would beneath a warped door, the worth inside a thing everyone else had already decided to throw away. Her mother used to say that the Lord hid his best blessings in the plainest wrapping, so a body had better learn to look twice before deciding a thing was empty. Naomi took that teaching the way some children take a hymn, singing it quietly to herself through every hardship that came after, and there would be many. She married Elias Vance when she was 22, a steady, sun-brown man with a laugh like a creek finding its way around stones, and together they had gone west with a wagon train in the spring of 1858, settling first in Nebraska Territory and later, after Elias caught word of good grazing and cheap timber claims, in the high country near a town called Piper's Crossing, in the Wyoming Territory, where the wind carried the smell of sage and the winters came down off the mountains like a closing door. They built a modest homestead together, a house, a small mercantile that Naomi kept the books for, a root cellar Elias dug with his own hands during a summer so hot the earth cracked like old pottery. They never had children, though not for lack of wanting. In the quiet of those years, Naomi's hands grew skilled at everything the frontier demanded, doctoring animals, canning against the winter, reading a man's character in the way he shook her husband's hand, and reading, too, in old letters and documents, the kind of careful truth that most people rushed past without seeing. It was Elias who first taught her to read a legal paper the way other men read scripture, slowly and more than once. He had been cheated as a young man by a land agent back in Ohio who'd sold him a claim already sold to someone else, and the humiliation of it had made him a careful reader of contracts and deeds for the rest of his life. He passed that carefulness to Naomi the way another husband might pass down a family Bible. And many evenings by lamplight they would sit together while he showed her how a deed's wording could hide an omission, how a signature could be forged with a patient hand, how the space between 2 lines sometimes held more truth than the lines themselves. Neither of them could have known how much that quiet education would matter, years later, to a woman left with nothing but her own eyes and her own stubborn attention. The fever came through Piper's Crossing in the autumn of 1877, riding in on a wagon of settlers from downriver, and it took 11 souls in 6 weeks, Elias Vance among them. Naomi buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the store they had built, and grief settled into her like a stone dropped into a well too deep to hear it land. She had thought, in her sorrow, that the hardest part was behind her. She had not yet met Reuben Hale in his true colors. Reuben was Elias's younger brother, a man who had drifted in and out of the territory over the years, chasing schemes that never quite paid, and who arrived within the month of the funeral with a lawyer from the county seat and a great deal of talk about family duty. He produced an old, water-stained copy of a will their father had drawn up decades before, back in Ohio, naming Elias and Reuben as joint heirs to all property and enterprise, and argued, with a lawyer nodding solemnly beside him, that since Naomi had never been named directly, and since she and Elias had no children to inherit through, the property reverted to him as the last living Vance. Naomi knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 15 years reading contracts by lamplight, that the argument was thin as creek ice in April. But she had no money for a lawyer of her own, no family standing beside her, and a county judge who rode through only twice a year and was, at that particular season, 300 miles away. Reuben did not even have the decency to feel the shame of it. He told her, quite plainly, that she was fortunate he was willing to let her take a mule and $9 and go join her sister rather than turn her out with nothing at all, as though generosity and theft could occupy the same sentence. She left Piper's Crossing on a gray October morning with her carpet bag, her mother's sewing scissors, a small tin of her husband's buttons she could not bear to leave behind, and the $9 folded twice inside her glove. The eastbound coach ran twice a week from the crossing toward the railhead, and from there she meant to travel on to her sister Delphine's home in Nebraska, where she hoped, without much conviction, that some kind of life might still be waiting for her. The coach was crowded that day with a family bound for Cheyenne, a drummer selling patent medicines, and a thin, feverish boy of perhaps 6 years old whose mother wept quietly the whole first hour of the journey, pressing a wet cloth to his forehead that had long since gone warm and useless. They stopped at midday to change horses at a relay station known locally as Widow Creek, little more than a barn, a well, and a low sod house kept by an old former freighter named Silas Pruitt, a widower himself, gruff-voiced but gentle-eyed, who had run that lonely post for 11 years and buried a wife and 2 horses on the hill behind it. While the new team was being harnessed, the sick boy's mother begged for cool water and a moment's rest, and Naomi, who could no more walk past a suffering child than she could stop her own heart from beating, climbed down to help, wetting cloths at the well, humming the boy a hymn her own mother used to sing, holding his small burning hand in hers while his mother gathered strength enough to go on. She lost track of the minutes. When she looked up, the coach was already 40 yards down the road, dust rising behind its wheels, and no amount of calling brought it back. The driver, watching black clouds building over the western ridge and eager to make the next station before the weather broke, had simply not thought to count his passengers before he snapped the reins. Silas Pruitt found her standing in the road with her carpet bag still on the porch behind her, staring after a coach that would not be returning, and he did what a decent man does in that country, which was to say nothing shaming and instead put a cup of coffee in her hands. There would not be another eastbound coach for 4 days. She had $9, minus what little she'd need for food, and a rapidly shortening list of choices. Silas, turning over some private thought of his own, finally said that he supposed she could take the empty loft above the barn for a night or two, but that if she wanted a roof that was truly her own, there was a strange offer he could make her, one he'd been unable to make to anyone else in 11 years of trying. Up a narrow ravine behind the station, he told her, some 3 miles into the foothills, sat the collapsed remains of an old camp that no survey map had ever properly recorded, an oversight or perhaps a mercy, depending on who you asked. Cattlemen called it cursed on account of some trouble there a dozen years back that nobody liked to speak of plainly, and so the land had simply sat forgotten, its quitclaim passed to Silas by a dying prospector who owed him a debt, worth nothing to anyone, taxed at almost nothing, wanted by no one. He would sign it over to her for $6, he said, not because it was worth $6, but because a person ought to have a door of her own to close at night, even if that door hung crooked on its hinge. Naomi, feeling the particular clarity that comes to a person who has run entirely out of other options, agreed. It was, she would tell people much later, the most foolish and the wisest $6 she ever spent in her life. She walked up into the hills the next morning with a borrowed mule, a hatchet, a tin of matches, and the small bundle of her belongings, following a trail so overgrown it seemed the land itself had tried to forget what once stood there. What she found when the trees opened into a shallow bowl of a valley, was not merely an abandoned homestead but the bones of an entire settlement. Perhaps a dozen collapsed cabins arranged with a kind of care that spoke of people who had meant to stay, the burned frame of what must once have been a small chapel, a well lined carefully with fitted stone, and here and there among the weeds, small hand-carved markers where someone had once buried their dead with tenderness. It was, she understood slowly and with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, a whole community vanished. She spent that first evening simply clearing enough of one cabin, the sturdiest, its roof half fallen but its stone hearth and chimney still standing true, to make a fire and a place to sleep, too tired and too heartsore to wonder much beyond the next hour's warmth. It was on the third morning, while prying up a loose hearthstone she meant to reset more firmly against the coming cold, that her fingers found the edge of something that was not stone at all, a shallow cavity dug beneath the hearth, lined with what had once been oiled canvas, and inside it, wrapped tight against the damp, a tin dispatch box no bigger than a Bible, its lid rusted and nearly shut. It took her the better part of an hour with a knife blade and patient hands to work it open, and when she finally did, what lay inside was not gold, not coin, but paper, a bound ledger in a careful, looping hand, several folded letters gone brittle and brown at the creases, and a small hand-drawn map of the very valley she was standing in, every cabin numbered and named. She read by firelight late into that night, and what she learned humbled her clean through. The camp had been called Canaan Hollow, founded in 1864 by a company of some 30 formerly enslaved men and women who had made their way west after the war reached them, led by a preacher named Amos Freeman, who had filed, properly, legally, with the correct county recorder. The ledger insisted again and again in his own careful hand, claims to this valley under the Homestead Act. Each family's plot numbered and witnessed. They had built their chapel, dug their well, planted their first orchard, and buried their first child born free on that hillside, and for 2 years they had lived there in a peace hard-won and dearly loved. Then, in the autumn of 1866, a band of night riders in the employ of a cattle baron named Colonel Ashby Wren, who wanted the valley's water rights for his growing herds and had no patience for black homesteaders holding land he considered rightfully his by strength alone, had come down on Canaan Hollow in the dark, burned the chapel, scattered the herd, and driven every soul from the valley at gunpoint before dawn, warning them never to return nor to speak of their claims again on pain of worse. Before he fled with his people, Preacher Freeman had buried the settlement's ledger and its founding papers beneath his own hearth, along with a note. Naomi found it folded separately, ink faded nearly to nothing, addressed to whoever might someday find this place again, asking them, if they had any mercy in them, to see that Canaan Hollow's people or their children were made whole. Naomi sat with that letter in her lap for a long while, the fire burning low, and felt something shift inside her that was larger than her own grief. She had come to this valley believing herself the most wronged person in it, a widow cheated of her home by her own husband's brother. And here, buried beneath her own 2 feet, was a wrong 12 years older and far graver than her own, waiting patiently in the dark for someone willing to look twice at a thing everyone else had decided was empty. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of the valley's whole buried history. Naomi walked the numbered plots with the hand-drawn map in hand, matching cabin to name, and began to understand that Preacher Freeman's ledger was not merely a record of who had lived there, but a careful legal account. Witness claims, dated filings, even a copy of correspondence with the Territorial Land Office acknowledging receipt of the homestead applications, which meant, if the ledger could be trusted and verified, that Canaan Hollow's people had held lawful title to this land at the very moment they were driven from it, a title that under the law had never actually lapsed, merely gone unclaimed by anyone who knew to claim it. She thought of her husband's careful lessons in reading a document silences, and understood that this was precisely such a silence. 12 years of a wrong nobody had contested only because nobody who might contest it had ever known where to look. She rode down to Piper's Crossing 3 days later, ostensibly to buy flour and nails, but truly to learn whether anyone in that town remembered Canaan Hollow at all, and it was there she met Ezekiel Coates, the town's blacksmith, a broad, careful man in his 30s who kept his forge fire hot and his words few. When she mentioned the valley by name, watching his face rather than waiting for his answer, she saw something move behind his eyes, recognition, and old pain riding close behind it. His grandmother, he told her finally, after she had bought his trust with an hour's honest conversation and the plain truth of what she'd found, had been among the children carried out of that valley in the dark of that autumn night, not yet 5 years old, clutching nothing but a wooden spoon her mother had pressed in her hand as they ran. The family had scattered afterward, some north, some further west, and his grandmother, before she passed, had spoken of Canaan Hollow only rarely, and always with a grief too old and too tired for anger, believing the land and everything buried in it long lost to time. Naomi told him what she had found, and watched a man built like an anvil sit down heavily on an overturned bucket, put his face in his hands, and weep without shame in the middle of his own forge. It did not take long for word to travel that a widow had settled into the old cursed camp, and less time still for it to reach the ears of Garrett Wren, son of the very colonel whose riders had emptied Canaan Hollow 12 years before, and who had, since his father's death, quietly consolidated the old man's herds and holdings into the largest cattle operation in the county, along with a controlling hand in the coming railroad spur that surveyors said would need to cross precisely that ravine to reach the best grade through the hills. Garrett Wren rode up to the camp himself within the week, dressed in a fine coat entirely wrong for the country, and made Naomi an offer for a quitclaim that was, on its face, generous, $20, more than 3 times what she had paid, delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a story about wanting to be neighborly to a widow alone. Naomi, who had learned long ago to read the space between a man's words, thanked him kindly and declined, and watched the smile thin at the edges into something closer to its true shape. He returned twice more that autumn, each time with a slightly higher offer and a slightly less patient tone. And when persuasion failed him, he tried another approach entirely. Riding in a piper's crossing to speak with the same county recorder his father had once bribed and intimidated with ease, seeking to have Naomi's $6 quitclaim declared void on some technicality of filing, or the whole valley reclassified as unclaimed rangeland available to the highest bidder, which was, of course, himself. He was a man accustomed to a country that had let his father get away with murder in all but name, and he could not quite believe, at first, that a widow with a tin box of old papers might actually stand in his way. Word came to Naomi, through Silas Pruitt, who still watched the road with the same steady eye he'd kept for 11 years, that Wren had begun telling folks around the county that the camp's new owner was hiding something up there she had no right to, stirring just enough suspicion that a few of the more nervous townsfolk began to eye Naomi sideways when she came down for supplies, uncertain whether to treat her as a curiosity, a threat, or simply a fool who'd bought herself a haunted valley. Naomi understood, with the clear, cold logic her husband had once taught her, that a tin box of papers found by one woman alone in an empty valley would convince no judge and stop no man like Garrett Wren, no matter how true its contents. What she needed was witnesses, living people who could stand beside those papers and say, "This was ours, this is true, we remember." And so, through the early winter, with Ezekiel Coates's help and his grandmother's old letters as a starting thread, Naomi began the patient work of tracing what had become of Canaan Hollow's scattered families, writing careful letters in her steady hand to churches and freedmen's aid societies in 3 territories, asking after names copied straight from Preacher Freeman's ledger: the Boudreaux family, the Tillmans, the widow Odom and her 5 children, a young man named Cassius Reed who the ledger noted had been the settlement's schoolteacher. It was slow, uncertain work, answered more often by silence than by reply, and there were nights that first hard winter, alone in the mended cabin with snow sifting through the roof's remaining gaps, when Naomi wondered whether she had traded one impossible situation for another, simply harder to see the end of. But letters did come back, slowly, through the turning of that winter into spring. First from a Baptist mission in Kansas that had record of a Boudreaux family settled nearby. Then, astonishingly, from Cassius Reed himself, now a schoolmaster of considerable reputation in Denver, who wrote back within the month in a hand so full of careful hope that Naomi read it twice through tears. He remembered Canaan Hollow, he wrote. He had been 16 the night the riders came, old enough to carry a younger child on his back 3 miles through the dark before dawn, and he had never in 12 years stopped believing that a wrong that size would someday have to answer for itself. He would come, he said, and would bring whoever else among the scattered families he could reach, if Naomi could tell him truly that there was something worth coming back to. By the time the mountain snow gave way to the first green shoots of spring, Naomi had gathered sworn statements, old letters, and the promise of testimony from 6 surviving members or descendants of the original Canaan Hollow families, along with Preacher Freeman's original ledger and its territorial filing correspondence, carefully preserved now in oiled cloth of her own devising. She rode to the county seat with Silas Pruitt and Ezekiel Coates beside her and petitioned the circuit judge, a deliberate, unhurried man named Judge Corwin Ash, who happened, fortunately for the cause of justice, to be a man who disliked Garrett Wren considerably more than he disliked paperwork, to formally recognize the original homestead filings of Canaan Hollow as never lawfully abandoned, but merely interrupted by force. Garrett Wren, informed of the hearing, arrived with his own lawyer and a great deal of blustering talk about squatters and vagrant claims. But he had not reckoned on Cassius Reed standing calm and educated in that courtroom describing, in his own clear voice, the night he carried a child through the dark away from Wren riders whose leader he could still, after 12 years, describe by name and by the particular cruelty of his laugh. He had not reckoned, either, on a widow's careful reading of every silence in his own lawyer's arguments, catching a discrepancy in the date of his father's original range claim that placed it a full 18 months after Preacher Freeman's own lawful filing. A discrepancy Judge Ash found, upon examination of the original land office records Naomi had thought to request by post that winter, to be entirely accurate. Judge Ash ruled, in the end, that the original homestead claims of Canaan Hollow stood valid and had never lapsed, their filing predating any competing claim by the Wren family by a year and a half, and that the valley's rightful title belonged collectively to the surviving members of the founding families and their heirs, Naomi's own quitclaim to be honored as a good faith purchase, but folded generously into the whole, at her own insistence, rather than held apart. Garrett Wren left the courthouse a paler man than he had entered it, his railroad spur suddenly requiring a costly detour, his father's old cruelty laid bare before half the county in a single afternoon, not punished by fire or violence in return, but by something perhaps harder for a proud man to bear, which was simply being seen clearly, at last, for what he and his father truly were. That summer, Canaan Hollow rose again. Cassius Reed returned with 3 families in tow, and more came through the following year as word traveled along the same quiet networks of churches and mission societies that had once helped scatter them. Ezekiel Coates moved his forge up from Piper's Crossing to serve the rebuilding, striking the first new nail for the rebuilt chapel himself with tears standing openly in his eyes. And Naomi, who had once owned $6 worth of cursed, forgotten ground, found herself instead the keeper of its ledgers once more, this time by the whole community's willing choice rather than any claim of ownership. Her steady hand and her husband's old lessons in reading a document's honesty put finally, fully, to their truest use. As for Reuben Hale, word reached her that autumn that his own mismanagement of the Piper's Crossing store, without her careful bookkeeping to steady it, had run the business finally and thoroughly into the ground, and that a county lawyer, moved, some said, by the very story now traveling through 3 territories of a widow who had righted an old and terrible wrong, had taken up Naomi's original claim against him at no charge, forcing a settlement that returned to her, at last, a fair portion of what had once been rightfully hers. And so we come back to where we began, to a woman of 43 standing alone in the mud beside a road, watching a coach disappear that would never return for her, with $9 in her glove and nothing left in this world but her own 2 capable hands. It would have been easy, that day, to see only the ending of things, a home lost, a husband gone, a family's cruelty laid bare, a coach's dust settling on an empty road. But Naomi Vance had been raised to look twice at a thing before deciding it was worthless. And that single inherited habit, patient, unglamorous, entirely her own, was what let her see, beneath $6 worth of cursed ground, not an ending at all, but a promised 12 years unanswered, waiting only for someone willing to kneel down in the dirt and look. Thank you for spending this time with Naomi and the valley she helped bring home. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs reminding that worth is often hidden in the plainest, most overlooked places, and we'd love it if you'd subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories like hers. Before you go, we'll leave you with this. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us below. We read every word. Until next time, stay close.